When you take a look at the 2024 F1 driver standings, as of 3 rounds in, one thing appears to be clear. Yuki Tsunoda is carrying Racing Bulls. 6 points to Daniel 0, 3-0 in qualifying head-to-head in favour of Yuki. Helmut Marko critical of Daniel and very kind about Yuki. The pressure, even though we're only 3 races in, is already mounting on the Australian, in part because expectation was, rightly, very high. Well, today I wanted to look at the facts, dive into the data and do my best to compare the two as objectively, as reasonably as possible. Is it panic stations time for Ricciardo, or is it all overblown waffle? My name's Tommo. Let's talk about it. Now, this video could not happen without the data I got through f1tempo.com. This is not a sponsored video, they just offer an incredibly insightful, interesting service. If you're interested in getting into the data, diving deep, f1tempo.com is the place to go. Also, they've got a buy me a coffee link if you want to help support what they do. So let's start with the comparisons, Yuki to Daniel in qualifying. The headline stat is this. In 3 rounds so far in 2024, the two drivers have set 10 representative lap times that can be compared in qualifying. Typically you do 2 laps in Q1, 2 laps in Q2, right? Over the total 3, they did 4 quick laps in Bahrain, 4 quick laps in Saudi, 2 comparable laps in Australia. Of those 10, Yuki has gone quicker than Daniel in 9 of them. But the gaps have been varied. So let's start in Bahrain. Both drivers got to Q2, so 2 quick laps in Q1, 2 quick laps in Q2. Yuki was quicker every single time, but never by more than 2 tenths. In fact, the average gap over those 4 is exactly 1/10 of a second. Minimal, marginal, nothing you can really take too much from. They were pretty close on quali pace in Bahrain. Then in Saudi Arabia, again, both drivers got to Q2. Yuki got to Q3 this time, but that's besides the point. We can't compare when only one driver gets to Q3, so 4 laps to look at. And in Q1, it was very, very tight. In fact, Ricciardo went quicker than Tsunoda on their first push laps in Q1 by 16 thousandths of a second. And then on the second lap, Tsunoda went quicker than Ricciardo by 77 thousandths of a second. So up until this point, these first kind of 6 qualifying comparable laps, there's been pretty much nothing in it. Then came Q2 in Saudi Arabia, and that was a much bigger struggle for Daniel Ricciardo. He was over 3.5 tenths off of Yuki on their first push lap and almost half a second off Yuki on the second. And that's what got Yuki to Q3. Daniel said post-qualifying, "We simply just plateaued. Even if I had another set now, I don't think I'd go any quicker. Honestly, that's the confusing part for now." The inconsistency and the confusion going from Q1 to Q2, certainly somewhat concerning. Because then finally we're in Australia, and for the purposes of this, I am not deleting Daniel's second push lap that he set in Q1, which obviously was deleted for track limits in real life. Lap time gain is marginal. At the end of the day, I want as many data points as possible to try and compare their actual pace. So I'm putting it back in. Because even with that lap back in, Yuki was faster on both laps, averaging out in that Q1 session over those 2 laps, 0.186 quicker than Daniel. But when we combine all 10 laps that have been sat in comparable circumstances on track between Yuki and Daniel, that average gap is of course advantage Yuki by 0.168 of a second. Again, that is including the lap that Daniel had deleted in Australia. It is smaller than I expected, to be honest, and certainly way smaller when you only compare their highlight times from each session that they both got furthest into, which is what I track on Twitter. And you can argue that is the crunch time lap at the end of the day. And Daniel really took a hit in Saudi there. That gap over those averaged is 0.446 of a second. Yuki's got about 2 tenths in hand over Daniel in qualifying, which isn't great, but it's not awful. Qualifying is the ultimate test of confidence in your car. It's the only time all weekend you're on low fuel, fresh tyres, giving it 100%, unless of course you're pushing for fastest lap. But even then, you're going to leave a bit more margin, I think, pushing for fastest lap at the end. You don't need to go absolute hell for leather like you do in qualifying. And actually, whilst putting these numbers together, I was listening to the race podcast, and Ed Straw had a really interesting bit of insight around Daniel Ricciardo's thoughts and feelings after qualifying in Australia. And certainly Daniel Ricciardo was pretty puzzled after qualifying, saying he's still a bit sceptical about the car because he did the lap a 117.466. Okay, the time was deleted, but even then it was a tenth slower than Tsunoda, a 117.356, which surprised him. I was there when he saw the lap time Tsunoda did in Q2, a 116.791, and clearly he was quite surprised by it. He admitted, with track evolution, I know I couldn't do that. Surprise and confusion, both words that Daniel has dropped so far this season already. Doesn't bode well, because if you made a mistake and been like, all right, I made a mistake, put my hands up and I lost a bit of time. If you're surprised or confused as to where that pace is, even if you do a clean lap, you're not going to find that time. Is he surprised because he's underestimating Yuki? Is he surprised that he's not able to extract the performance and get the best version of himself out in this Racing Bulls? Maybe a bit of both. And also, Yuki's Q2 time in Australia was, by all measurements, a fantastic lap. He was only 41 thousandths slower than Lando Norris in the McLaren, and we saw how quick the McLarens were last weekend. This is Yuki's fourth season at that team. It's all he knows in Formula One. Kind of can't help but draw similarities to Ricciardo being at McLaren, going in alongside Norris. Norris is a lot younger than him, established in that team. That's all Norris has ever known, driving that McLaren. Yes, cars do change over time, of course, but inherent characteristics often persist and continue over, multiple different regulation changes, right? Yuki's reaping the benefit of that consistency, and Daniel is coming in and going to have to get on top of the nuances of this car, because it's not the same as a Red Bull. Yes, he spent his early career at that team, at Toro Rosso, but his life and the team have changed in so many ways since then. That challenge of going into a team and jumping on top of a car and getting on top of it as quickly as, Fernando Alonso, for example, he's the prime example of someone who's jumped between so many different teams, but always, he's never missed. Doesn't matter what team. He's always been up to speed. That comes easier to some drivers than others, and from the evidence we've seen with McLaren and now with Racing Bulls, Daniel doesn't have that adaptability to immediately jump onto a car like Fernando does. And maybe Fernando's too high of an expectation to set, but I think, we've seen enough now that, yes, Daniel was good in a Red Bull, good in a Renault, but he's not been able to convert that performance consistently in a McLaren, and he's had 10 races now in a Racing Bulls AlphaTauri over these 2 seasons. Yes, of course, he had the injury as well. I'd expecting him to be beating Yuki now. I think most people were. When you consider all 10 data points, things aren't crisis by any stretch, but also having 2/10 deficit to your teammate, given how close and tight and packed that field is outside of Max, of course. 2/10 is enough to stick you out in Q1, and then all of a sudden you've got an uphill struggle. You're starting on the back foot going into the races. So what about Sundays then? Let's take a look at some stints. Okay, let's analyse some data, because Daniel did finish ahead of Yuki in Bahrain, P13 and 14 in the end. Then Yuki finished ahead of Daniel in Saudi, P15, P16, and of course most recently in Australia. Yuki benefiting of course from Hamilton, Russell, Verstappen being out, but got P7 in the end, big points on the board. And even with all those retirements, Daniel could only manage P12. So let's start in Bahrain and take a look at a couple of stints that I think are comparable, because both started on fresh softs, then both pitted onto fresh hards, and then Daniel went for scrub softs at the end, whereas Yuki was put onto another set of hards. And of course, in hindsight, the Ricciardo strategy was the correct one, hence why he was able to catch and overtake Yuki at the end, even though Yuki had been ahead all race. We can't compare that final stint, but we can compare the first two. Now, of course, the first stint does come caveats. You're battling, more so anyway, at the start, and you're always going to be having some battles throughout the race. But looking at F1 tempo and trying to take what looks like the cleanest kind of stints from both drivers that actually give us comparable times. So that first stint, excluding the first lap, is 11 until Ricciardo pitted on lap 13, and in that time Yuki climbed from P11 to P10, Daniel from P14 to P13. Yuki's average lap time on that first 11 lap stint of kind of clean laps was a 138.548, Daniel 138.998. So advantage Yuki by 4.5 tenths a lap, pretty significant gap, advantage Yuki. The second stint though, both on fresh hards, 18 laps that look somewhat comparable here. Yuki averaged a 137.703, Daniel averaged a 137.863. So advantage Tsunoda again, but by a much smaller 0.16 of a second per lap. Look, by every measurement, Tsunoda had the upper hand this weekend. He was given a fresh hard instead of a scrub soft in that final stint. I understand why he was frustrated, of course. He was quicker than Ricciardo all weekend. Given the wrong strategy, Ricciardo passes him. Boom, like, imagine what Yuki could have delivered if he'd been given the scrub soft at the end. However, his reaction was, of course, it was petulant, screaming and shouting over the radio. But it's bad enough. It's seen as bad enough in some instances, but you can accept that. But then driving like a knob, you know, on the outlap. It won't have done his stock any favours within that team or outside of that team, because Yuki's got to consider maybe his future doesn't carry on beyond this year at Racing Bulls. Maybe they keep Ricciardo in the Racing Bulls and Lawson gets his seat. Like, he needs to make himself look appealing to other teams, and you can't tell me a single team principal on the grid would have looked at Yuki's behaviour at the end of that race and thought like, alright, yeah, I can trust that guy. It's not good enough. He needs to improve on that, because otherwise he's getting pretty complete. As for Saudi Arabia, it's really difficult to take any meaningful information from that race, right? Both started on a medium and both pitted on lap 7 for the hard. I mean, the start of the race at Saudi is chaos. You obviously had Yuki scrapping with Ollie Behrman and Lance Stroll, Daniel in a Hulkenberg Ocon sandwich. I can't in good faith compare this first stint. There's not enough laps. There's just too many caveats in terms of battling. I don't think we're going to get anything meaningful from that. So then I would look to the hard stint. Obviously, both drivers pitted the hard. It was a one stop for pretty much everyone. But obviously, you had Magnussen. The Magnussen train, Yuki was trying to get past, couldn't get past. Should have got past, but then also Magnussen kind of, you know, took the penalty and held people up, which then just completely skews the results of their long stint. So I'm not going to take any data from Saudi. I want to look at the stints that are actually comparing the drivers in as equal circumstances as possible. And when they're both in a DRS train, I've got nothing to pull from that. And also Daniel had his spin, didn't he? Which wasn't a good reflection. But yeah, we'll move on from Saudi and look at Australia. Ricciardo started on the soft, Yuki on the medium. It wasn't until lap 11 that both drivers were on the same tyre, the hard. We've got lap 11 till 28. We can compare. Caveat, Daniel did pit for his hards 4 laps before Yuki. And I'm going to exclude lap 17 and 18 because they were both affected by the VSC that Hamilton brought out when he pulled over. That gives us 16 laps where Yuki set an average of a 123.027 and Daniel an average of a 123.204. That puts the gap at 0.177 advantage Yuki. You can see on F1 Tempo that Daniel's times do start to slow just before he pits. He's, you know, lapping about half a second slower towards the end of his stint. So realistically, this gap is probably more like 1/10. Yuki still was quicker than Daniel, but not by much. And then the second stint we could look at in Australia, laps 41 to 52. Yuki does have 7 laps fresher hards, so caveat there. Over those 12 laps, Yuki averaged a 121.530, Daniel a 121.572, so 0.042 advantage Yuki. But again, with those fresher tyres, I'd argue that gap is pretty much non-existent. If anything, Daniel might have been fractionally quicker there. Look, there's a clear trend. Yuki is consistently quicker than Daniel. That's objectively true. And the pace gap relative in qualifying seems to be about 0.2, in race 1 to 0.2. So it's not crazy. And certainly that's how I'm interpreting the data. But if you think I'm getting this wrong, and again, feel free to use F1 Tempo yourself and look at all this and break down all the times. And if you've got any other additional insight, anything I've missed, let me know in the comments below. But when you look at Daniel's experience, his CV, and you look at Yuki and it's still not proven to a lot of people that he deserves even to be in this sport, which I think is crazy now to say. But these numbers suggest an experienced driver who is somewhat confused and surprised by his lack of pace. Look, I rate Yuki very highly, okay? I've been calling him a rough diamond for years now. But I rate peak Ricciardo higher than I do peak Yuki. Peak Ricciardo was notorious for his controlled aggression and his confidence on the brakes. Peak Ricciardo could match Verstappen over a lap in a Red Bull in 2018, which I think Max's raw pace hasn't got much better. I just think he's more complete since then. And peak Ricciardo was not confused or surprised by the car that was underneath him. In my opinion, Yuki has built year on year, and I think on form, he's in the top 10 drivers in Formula 1 right now, pretty comfortably. I think his raw speed, just his raw speed, is not far off Norris, Russell, Alonso, these drivers' science. I firmly believe that. He's still got a way to go to be as complete as those drivers, a long way to go. The raw ingredients are there. Daniel needs to fix this, because if he wants any shot at getting that Red Bull seat, the bare minimum he has to do is beat Yuki Tsunoda. Like, it doesn't even matter how Checo does if he has a bad season. If Yuki beats Daniel and continues to show this kind of gap, and again, we're looking at, this is the data we see. The team itself internally is going to have way more data than we have, that they're going to be pouring over, and they're going to, maybe the gap is even bigger than we think it is. Maybe it's a bit smaller. In my preseason predictions, I was like, I think Ricciardo's going to beat Tsunoda over the course of the season, because I think being back in that Red Bull family and having that Red Bull seat to work towards, I think we're going to see the old Daniel back. And yes, it's only been 3 races this season. It's been 10 races over the course of this season and the end of last season. Yes, of course, he was massively curtailed by the injury. Arguably his best performance came in Mexico last year after the injury. He had a great debut in Hungary as well. I was really concerned for Yuki after that race. I was there and I saw Daniel lapping quicker than him and out qualifying him. I was like, oh man, this could be curtains for Yuki. But he's bounced back, and in those 10 races, I'd say, yeah, there's only been 2 occasions, Hungary and Mexico, where Daniel has beaten Yuki, as in been more impressive than Yuki anyway. I really hope he does find something. Not that I want him to beat Yuki, not that I want him to get Checo's seat. I'm a fan of the guy, and seeing someone's career that was so promising, and he was such an exciting driver to watch, driving with such a smile on his face and such a confidence as well. Cutting it up at Toro Rosso, usurping Seb at Red Bull, even doing bits at Renault. Why'd you leave Renault, man? Alpine would be flying if he was still in that car, I reckon. He's clearly a top bloke, and I don't want his F1 career to fade out. I want it to end on some kind of high. If he doesn't get the Red Bull seat, then he's at least got to put himself on the market. Maybe like, I don't know, Aston Martin. Like if Alonso goes, Ricciardo, like Aston Martin, Lawrence Stroll loves a higher profile name. He signed Seb to replace Checo, even though that wasn't a merit-based decision clearly, because Checo was one of the best drivers in 2020. Then he signs Alonso, another huge name. Ricciardo's a massive name, biggest driver in America, arguably, right? And obviously huge in Australia, massive character. But right now, if I'm Lawrence Stroll and I'm looking at potential replacements for Fernando Alonso, Daniel Ricciardo is not doing enough to give me the confidence that he's that guy. I don't know. Thoughts and feelings as always in the comments below. My name's Tommo. Thanks again. Have a good one. Ta-da.